Hey everyone, today we're tackling a question most people won't touch. What happens when an emperor's grief turns into something history can barely comprehend? Forget the sanitized version. The truth is stranger and more revealing. Imagine you're watching this with a cup of something strong, because you'll need it. Ancient Rome had its share of bizarre imperial tales, but few match the disturbing saga of a teenage boy named Sporus and his forced transformation into the living memorial of Emperor Nero's dead wife. This isn't just a footnote in classical history. It's a window into the absolute power of Roman emperors and how that power warped everything it touched. Before we dive in, let me be clear. This story involves historical allegations about private life in antiquity. No graphic detail. We'll focus on political implications and source bias. The Romans themselves struggled with how to document this story, and modern historians still debate which parts are propaganda and which reflect reality. But the central facts? Those aren't really in dispute. So, who was Sporus? Initially, nobody, just one of countless anonymous teenagers living in Rome during the 60s CE, during Nero's reign. His birth name might not even have been Sporus. That could have been given to him later. We know almost nothing about his early life. Not his family, not his status, not how he caught the emperor's attention. He emerges into history only when Nero dragged him into the imperial spotlight. And why did Nero fixate on this particular youth? According to our ancient sources, often hostile and written decades later, it was because Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to Nero's second wife, Poppaea Sabina. The same Poppaea who had died under, shall we say, questionable circumstances. Let's back up and set the stage. Nero became emperor in the year 54 CE, when he was just 16 years old. Initially guided by his tutor Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, Nero's early reign was actually considered pretty decent, the famous 5 good years of Nero. But after these advisors lost influence, and after Nero had his mother Agrippina murdered in the year 59, things took a darker turn. By the year 62, Nero had divorced and banished his first wife Octavia, daughter of the previous emperor Claudius. The official reason? Barrenness. The actual reason? He had fallen hard for Poppaea Sabina, an ambitious and beautiful noblewoman who was already married herself. Not that a little detail like someone else's marriage would stop an emperor. So now Nero has his new love Poppaea as his empress. But their relationship was volatile, to put it mildly. In the year 65, something went catastrophically wrong. Our sources don't agree on exactly what happened. The historian Tacitus reports that Poppaea was pregnant when Nero, in a fit of anger, kicked her in the stomach, killing both her and their unborn child. Suetonius offers a similar account. But remember our source discipline. These writers were part of the senatorial class that had every reason to portray Nero in the worst possible light. Did Nero really kill his wife in a rage? Or did she die from pregnancy complications, which were terrifyingly common in the ancient world? We can't know with absolute certainty. What we do know is that Nero's grief was extreme and theatrical. He had Poppaea's body embalmed rather than cremated, unusual for Romans, delivered an excessive funeral eulogy praising her beauty above all else, and reportedly burned a year's worth of Arabian incense at her funeral. He even had her deified, made into a goddess, which was the ultimate honor. But grief takes strange forms, especially in people with unlimited power and questionable mental stability. Sometime after Poppaea's death, our sources suggest the year 67, Nero's attention fixed on the young teen Sporus. And what happened next defies modern comprehension. The emperor saw in this boy the ghost of his dead wife. Whether the resemblance was truly remarkable or more in Nero's imagination, we'll never know. But what we do know is that Nero did something unprecedented even by the standards of Roman emperors. He ordered the boy to undergo physical alterations to more closely resemble Poppaea. Ancient biographers writing decades later report that Sporus was physically modified to appear more feminine, though the exact nature of these alterations remains a subject of scholarly debate. What's clear is that this wasn't the boy's choice. It was the emperor's command. And in a world where the emperor's word was absolute law, Sporus had no option to refuse. Then came the next phase of this disturbing transformation. Nero gave the boy Poppaea's name, dressed him in the empress's clothes, assigned him female attendants, and, most shocking to Roman sensibilities, held an actual public wedding ceremony. Think about that. Not a private arrangement kept behind palace walls, but a public ceremony with all the traditional rituals. The ancient biographer Suetonius writes that Sporus was given a dowry, dressed in wedding veils, and that the populace of Rome offered public congratulations as though he were a legitimate empress. Cassius Dio, another historian, though writing even later, claims Nero had this teenager treated with all the honors of an empress. He was carried around in a litter, accompanied Nero to the courts and the games, and was even publicly embraced by the emperor. But here's where we need to be careful with our sources. Both Suetonius and Dio were writing well after Nero's death, during dynasties that had every political reason to portray the last Julio-Claudian emperor as a depraved monster. Their accounts are filled with sensationalism designed to shock their readers. That doesn't mean they invented the core story. There's too much consistency across sources for that. But they likely embellished the details for maximum scandal. What we're looking at isn't just a personal tragedy for Sporus. It's a demonstration of how Roman imperial power functioned. Nero could reshape reality around him simply because no one could stop him. The normal social boundaries that would have made such actions unthinkable for ordinary Romans simply didn't apply to the emperor. If you're thinking this couldn't possibly get weirder, buckle up. We're just getting started. What makes this story particularly difficult to parse is that we're dealing with an emperor who existed at the intersection of absolute power and theatrical self-expression. Nero wasn't just Rome's ruler. He fancied himself an artist, a performer. Everything he did had an element of performance to it. His treatment of Sporus wasn't just a private arrangement. It was a public spectacle that all of Rome was forced to acknowledge. The Roman historian Cassius Dio tells us that after the marriage, Nero insisted on Sporus being addressed as lady and empress. Court officials, senators, and foreign dignitaries all had to maintain this fiction, at least to Nero's face. Behind closed doors, they must have been absolutely bewildered. Imagine being a senator or foreign ambassador preparing to meet the Roman emperor, only to find yourself having to address a teenage boy as Augusta, Empress, while keeping a straight face. But here's where it gets even more bizarre. Not long after this arrangement with Sporus began, Nero himself married another man, his freedman Pythagoras. But in this ceremony, Nero took the role of the bride. Let that sink in. The Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the Western world, publicly played bride in a wedding ceremony with a former slave. Again, our source discipline reminder. These accounts come primarily from Suetonius and Cassius Dio, both writing after Nero's death, and both with political reasons to portray him as degenerate. But the consistency of these accounts across multiple sources suggests there's a core truth here, even if the details might be exaggerated. What was Nero doing? Was this all part of some artistic self-expression, a deliberate flouting of Roman sexual and gender norms? Or was it, as some modern scholars suggest, a calculated political move to demonstrate that the emperor transcended all normal social boundaries? Remember, Roman sexual mores were very different from our own, but they still had rigid expectations about who could do what, with whom. The central concern wasn't gender, but status and role. A freeborn Roman man could have sexual relations with slaves, prostitutes, or others of lower status, but only if he took the active role. To take the passive role was considered deeply shameful for a Roman citizen, and doubly so for an emperor. So by publicly taking the bride role with Pythagoras, while simultaneously having Sporus as his wife, Nero was essentially declaring that normal Roman sexual codes didn't apply to him. He was above the law, above tradition, above even the fundamental social boundaries that defined Roman masculinity. Meanwhile, what about Sporus himself? Our sources tell us frustratingly little about his personal experience or feelings. He appears in the historical record not as a person with agency, but as an object of Nero's will. We don't know if he resisted, or if he tried to make the best of an impossible situation. The sources portray him as passive, but that may say more about the biographer's limited interest in the inner life of someone they considered a mere imperial plaything than about Sporus himself. What we do know is that Sporus became a regular fixture in Nero's court. He appeared at official functions, accompanied the emperor on his infamous artistic tour of Greece in 66 and 67, and was treated, at least publicly, with the honors due to an empress. During that Greek tour, Nero indulged his artistic aspirations by competing in various games and performances, always winning, of course, because who would dare score the emperor poorly? Sporus was with him, dressed as an empress and watching from the imperial box as Nero made a spectacle of himself on stage. Imagine the conversations between the Greek elites watching this bizarre imperial pantomime play out. This period represents peak Neronian excess. Back in Rome, the emperor had already built his golden house, Domus Aurea, after the Great Fire of 64. A massive palace complex so extravagant that it became a symbol of his detachment from reality. The treasury was nearly empty from his building projects and artistic indulgences. Military matters were neglected in favor of theatrical pursuits. And throughout it all, there was Sporus, a living symbol of how far Nero had drifted from Roman norms and expectations. To the traditional Roman elite, seeing their emperor publicly fawning over a teenage boy dressed as a woman wouldn't just have been shocking. It would have confirmed their worst fears about Nero's fitness to rule. But here's where we need to be careful about reading history backward. To modern eyes, the most disturbing aspect of this story is the obvious exploitation of a minor who could not possibly have consented to this arrangement. But that's not what bothered Romans. What scandalized them was Nero's public flouting of gender roles and his degradation of imperial dignity. Ancient moralists like Dio Chrysostom condemned Nero not primarily for exploiting Sporus, but for marrying as both husband and wife, thereby confusing proper gender roles. This tells us something important about Roman values, and about how differently they viewed issues of consent and exploitation than we do today. By late 67, Nero's position was growing precarious. The treasury was depleted, military commanders were growing restive, the Senate was increasingly alienated, and the emperor himself seemed increasingly detached from political reality, focused instead on his artistic pursuits and personal indulgences, including his bizarre relationship with Sporus. While Nero was obsessing over theatrical performances in Greece, real power was slipping through his fingers. By early 68, the storm clouds were gathering. Military commanders in Gaul and Spain were in open rebellion. The Praetorian Guard's loyalty was wavering. The Senate was quietly watching for an opportunity. And through it all, Sporus remained at the emperor's side. No longer just a private indulgence, but a public symbol of Nero's transgression of Roman norms. All right, it's 68 CE, and Nero's decade-long reign is about to implode spectacularly. The emperor is still in Greece, living his best artistic life, with Sporus, his teenage empress, by his side, while Rome itself simmers with discontent. Let's talk about why Nero's position was becoming untenable, because it wasn't just about his bizarre personal arrangements. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64, which Nero almost certainly did not cause, despite the popular legend, he had built his massive golden house, seizing vast tracts of urban land for his personal use. This didn't win him any popularity contests with displaced Romans. Then there were the executions. After the Pisonian conspiracy in 65, a real plot to assassinate him, not imperial paranoia, Nero had gone on a killing spree, executing not just the actual conspirators, but also anyone he considered a potential threat, including his old tutor Seneca and the poet Lucan. Nothing makes the elite more nervous than seeing their peers arbitrarily executed. Add to this the empty treasury, military neglect, and Nero's apparent indifference to actual governing, and you had a perfect storm brewing. While Nero was performing on stage in Greece, a Gallic governor named Julius Vindex declared open rebellion, followed quickly by Servius Sulpicius Galba, the elderly governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, part of modern Spain. In March of 68, Nero finally returned to Rome from Greece, bringing Sporus with him. Imagine that homecoming. The emperor parading through Rome in a purple Greek-style robe, crowned with an Olympic wreath, with his boy Empress at his side. If he was trying to project strength and Roman virtue in the face of rebellion, this was not the way to do it. By April, news reached Rome that other military commanders were joining the rebellion. Nero's response was bizarrely detached. According to Suetonius, when he first heard about Galba's revolt, he was so unconcerned that he went off to watch some athletic games. The emperor seemed unable to process that his rule was in genuine danger. As spring turned to summer, Nero's position deteriorated rapidly. Although Vindex had been defeated, the rebellion was spreading. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty was essential for any emperor's survival, began to waver, especially after their prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, declared for Galba. By early June, the Senate had finally found its courage and declared Nero a public enemy. The same body that had rubber-stamped his every whim for 14 years now sentenced him to death by the old Republican punishment of being beaten to death with rods. And what about Sporus during all this? Our sources suggest he remained with Nero until almost the very end, a testament to either loyalty or the complete lack of any better options. As Nero's world collapsed around him, his empress was one of the few who didn't immediately abandon him. The end came on June 9, 68. With his guards gone and troops coming to arrest him, Nero fled to a freedman's villa outside Rome. Our ancient sources describe a pathetic scene. The emperor who had once commanded the known world now reduced to hiding in a grubby room, trying to work up the courage to kill himself. According to Suetonius, Nero's last night was spent with a small group of loyalists, including Sporus. The emperor alternated between self-pity, delusional plans for escape, and preparation for suicide. "What an artist dies in me," he supposedly lamented, more concerned with his artistic legacy than his political failures. When he finally heard the approaching horsemen, Nero steeled himself and asked one of his freedmen to help him commit suicide. With his final breath, he reportedly said, "Too late. This is fidelity." A strange choice of last words for a man who had betrayed so many. So ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The line of emperors descended, by blood or adoption, from Julius Caesar and Augustus. Nero died at age 30, the same age as Alexander the Great, though with a considerably less illustrious legacy. But our story doesn't end with Nero's suicide. What happened to Sporus, the teenager who had been forced into the role of imperial wife? This is where things take an even darker turn. With Nero dead, you might expect Sporus would have been allowed to fade back into obscurity. But no, his strange imperial connection made him a valuable political prize. Remember Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who betrayed Nero? He immediately claimed Sporus for himself. Yes, you heard that correctly. Nymphidius, who had helped bring down Nero, now took the emperor's wife as his own. Our sources suggest this was partly because Nymphidius claimed to be the illegitimate son of the previous emperor Caligula, and having Nero's empress would somehow strengthen his imperial credentials. There's also a suggestion that Sporus physically resembled Poppaea Sabina, with whom Nymphidius had allegedly been infatuated. Whatever his motives, Nymphidius's possession of Sporus was short-lived. When Galba finally arrived in Rome to claim his throne in late 68, the Praetorian Guard turned against Nymphidius and killed him. Once again, Sporus's fate hung in the balance as power changed hands. And here our story takes yet another bizarre turn. After Galba entered Rome as the new emperor, Sporus didn't disappear from the historical record. Instead, he somehow became attached to Galba's court, though apparently in a less prominent role than he had played under Nero. Think about the psychological reality here. Within the space of months, this young person had been Nero's empress, witness to Nero's suicide, claimed by Nymphidius as a sort of imperial trophy, transferred to Galba's household after Nymphidius's death. Each transition representing another trauma, another forced adaptation to the whims of powerful men who saw him not as a person, but as an object associated with imperial power. But the year of the 4 emperors was just getting started, and Sporus's ordeal was far from over. We're now in the notorious year 69 CE, known to history as the Year of the 4 Emperors. After Nero's suicide, the Roman Empire descended into chaos as rival generals fought for the throne. And somehow, improbably, our teenage protagonist Sporus remained caught in the imperial crossfire. Let's recap the dizzying sequence of power changes. After Nero's death, Galba, the elderly governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, took power. But by January 69, his strictness and refusal to pay the promised donative to the Praetorian Guard had made him deeply unpopular. On January 15th, a rival claimant emerged. Marcus Salvius Otho, a former friend of Nero's and once the husband of Poppaea Sabina. Yes, the same Poppaea whom Nero later married and whom Sporus was forced to resemble. Otho had initially supported Galba, hoping to be named his heir, but when Galba adopted Piso Licinianus instead, Otho conspired with the Praetorian Guard. The result? Galba and Piso were murdered in the Forum after just 7 months in power. Their heads were cut off and displayed on spears, a grim reminder of what happened to emperors who lost the military's support. Now Otho was emperor, and here's where Sporus enters the picture again. According to our sources, Otho took Sporus into his household. Think about how bizarre this arrangement was. Otho had once been married to Poppaea, then lost her to Nero, who later transformed Sporus into a simulacrum of Poppaea. Now Otho had both the throne and this living reminder of his former wife. Did Otho see Sporus as a way to symbolically reclaim Poppaea? Was it a political move to associate himself with Nero's memory? Nero remained popular with the common people, if not with the Senate? Or was it simply that Sporus, having been in the imperial household, was considered part of the imperial package that transferred from one emperor to the next? We'll never know for certain, because Otho's reign was even shorter than Galba's. Almost immediately after taking power, he faced a challenge from Vitellius, the commander of the legions in Germania. By April, Otho's forces had been defeated at the First Battle of Bedriacum in northern Italy. Rather than prolong the civil war, Otho committed suicide after just 3 months as emperor. And Sporus? Once again, he faced a transition of power and all the uncertainty that came with it. Vitellius entered Rome as the 3rd emperor in a single year, bringing with him a reputation for excess that rivaled Nero's own. His troops had ravaged much of northern Italy on their march to Rome, and Vitellius himself was known for his extravagant feasts and cruelty. Under Vitellius, Sporus's story takes an even darker turn. Our source here is Cassius Dio, who claims that Vitellius planned to use Sporus in a public spectacle, specifically a mythological enactment where Sporus would play the role of a maiden being ravished. This type of theatrical performance, called a mythological mime, was popular in Rome but often involved real violence against the performers, particularly condemned criminals. For Sporus, who had already endured years of objectification and exploitation, this was apparently the final indignity. Rather than submit to this public humiliation, Dio tells us that Sporus committed suicide. Think about that choice for a moment. After being passed from Nero to Nymphidius to Galba to Otho and finally to Vitellius, after being forced to play the role of a dead woman, paraded through Rome as an empress, witnessing the violent deaths of multiple emperors, it was the prospect of public sexual humiliation that finally drove Sporus to take his own life. If Dio's account is accurate, Sporus died sometime between April and December of 69 CE. His age at death? Probably still in his teens, or at most his very early 20s. A life defined entirely by how powerful men chose to use him, from Nero's living memorial to Vitellius's planned theatrical victim. The historical record falls silent on the exact manner of his death, or what happened to his remains. There was no state funeral, no mausoleum, no lasting monument. For someone who had been treated as an empress, Sporus's end was anonymous and unrecorded. A final indignity for someone whose entire identity had been erased and rewritten by imperial whim. Vitellius himself wouldn't last much longer. By December, a 4th claimant had emerged. Vespasian, commander of the legions in Judea. His forces defeated Vitellius's army at the Second Battle of Bedriacum, then marched on Rome. Vitellius was captured while trying to flee, dragged through the streets, tortured, and executed. His body was thrown into the Tiber River, the traditional end for criminals in Rome. With Vespasian's accession, the year of the 4 emperors finally ended. The new emperor would establish the Flavian dynasty, bringing a period of relative stability after the chaos that followed Nero's death. Vespasian ruled for 10 years, followed by his sons Titus and Domitian. None of them paragons of virtue, but at least competent administrators who didn't bankrupt the treasury or marry teenagers disguised as their dead wives. And what about Sporus's legacy? In the immediate aftermath, he was likely remembered as just another example of Neronian excess, a scandal rather than a tragedy. The ancient sources certainly treat him that way, more interested in how his story reflects on Nero than in Sporus as a person. But for modern historians, Sporus represents something else. A stark example of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how the Roman imperial system could enable the most extreme forms of personal exploitation. His story reveals the darker side of an empire that we often romanticize, the reality that behind the marble monuments and grand rhetoric lay a system where human beings could be completely remade according to an emperor's whim. Let's take a step back from our narrative and ask an essential question. How do we know any of this actually happened? The story of Sporus is so bizarre, so extreme in its details, that it seems almost like a work of fiction designed to illustrate the madness of absolute power. So, what evidence do we actually have? Our knowledge of Sporus comes primarily from three ancient authors: Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and, to a lesser extent, Tacitus. Each has strengths and weaknesses as a historical source, and each was writing with particular biases and agendas. Suetonius gives us the most detailed account in his Life of Nero, part of his Lives of the 12 Caesars, written around 120 CE, roughly 50 years after the events he describes. As the imperial secretary under Emperor Hadrian, Suetonius had access to the imperial archives and records that no longer survive. This gives his work some credibility. However, Suetonius was also writing for entertainment as much as for historical accuracy. His work is filled with salacious gossip, scandalous anecdotes, and moral judgments. He organized his biographies thematically rather than chronologically, making it difficult to establish exact sequences of events, and he had every reason to portray the Julio-Claudian emperors, including Nero, in a negative light to flatter his Flavian and Antonine patrons. Cassius Dio provides our second major source. His Roman history was written even later, in the early 3rd century, more than 130 years after Nero's death. Dio was a senator and had access to official records, but the massive chronological gap between events and his account makes his reliability questionable for specific details. Tacitus, generally considered our most reliable source for this period, mentions Sporus only briefly in his Annals. This work ends with the events of 66 CE, before the most dramatic parts of the Sporus story unfold. Tacitus's relative silence on Sporus might suggest that the later accounts were exaggerated, or it might simply reflect the incomplete nature of his surviving work. None of these authors were eyewitnesses to the events they describe. All were writing under later dynasties that had political reasons to portray Nero as a monster, and all were members of the elite class that had the most reason to despise Nero's populist tendencies and disregard for senatorial authority. So should we dismiss the entire Sporus story as propaganda? Not necessarily. While our sources likely exaggerated details for dramatic effect, the core events appear in multiple independent accounts with enough consistency to suggest a basis in fact. The story was also apparently known widely enough that authors could reference it with the expectation that their readers would understand. Moreover, the story contains elements that seem too specific and unusual to be pure invention. If you were creating propaganda against Nero, there were simpler and more traditional ways to portray him as a tyrant. His alleged matricide, his persecution of Christians, his artistic pretensions. The Sporus narrative is so bizarre that it seems more likely to be based on real events that were then embellished rather than fabricated from nothing. What's particularly interesting is how the ancient sources frame the Sporus story. For them, the scandal wasn't primarily about the exploitation of a minor, though that element is present. Instead, they focus on the gender transgression and the insult to Roman traditions of marriage. Suetonius places his account of Sporus in a section about Nero's sexual improprieties, alongside accounts of incest and other behaviors Romans considered deviant. This focus tells us something important about Roman values, and about how the story would have functioned as propaganda. For a Roman audience, seeing their emperor publicly flout gender norms by marrying a male and treating him as an empress would have been shocking proof of Nero's unfitness to rule. The story worked as propaganda precisely because it violated Roman sensibilities about proper imperial behavior. But even if we accept that something like the Sporus narrative really happened, we still face the problem of perspective. Our sources tell us virtually nothing about Sporus as a person. His thoughts, feelings, background, or fate are all subordinated to the story of Nero. Sporus exists in our historical record only as an object of imperial desire and a symbol of Nero's excess. This absence speaks volumes about how ancient historians viewed people without power or status, Unless they did something that affected the narrative of the powerful, they simply didn't matter enough to record. Sporus matters historically only because of his connection to Nero, not in his own right. Modern historians have tried to fill this gap by reading between the lines, looking for hints of Sporus's agency or perspective in the limited sources we have. Some have suggested that his apparent loyalty to Nero until the end might indicate Stockholm Syndrome or a pragmatic adaptation to his circumstances. Others have pointed to his ultimate suicide as evidence that he maintained some core of personal dignity despite years of objectification. But these interpretations, while psychologically plausible, remain speculative. The truth is that we will never know with certainty what Sporus thought or felt about his bizarre role in history. His voice, like those of countless others who lived on the margins of Roman society, is lost to us. What we can say with some confidence is that Sporus was a victim of imperial power at its most arbitrary and unconstrained. Whether Nero's treatment of him stemmed from genuine grief over Poppaea, sexual desire, or simple megalomaniacal whim, the result was the complete erasure of one person's identity to satisfy another's fantasies. In that sense, Sporus serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost of absolute power. Behind the grand narratives of emperors and empires lie countless individual tragedies, people whose lives were bent or broken by a system that concentrated immense power in the hands of individuals who often proved unworthy of it. To truly understand the story of Sporus, we need to place it within the larger context of Nero's reign and personality. Because what happened to this teenager wasn't just a random act of imperial madness. It was part of a pattern of behavior that defined Nero's rule, especially in its later years. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus became emperor in October of 54 CE at the age of 16. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, he was the son of Agrippina the Younger, and the great-great-grandson of Augustus through his mother's line. He came to the throne only because his mother had married his great-uncle, the Emperor Claudius, and persuaded him to adopt Nero as his son and heir, bypassing Claudius's biological son Britannicus. When Claudius died in 54, possibly poisoned by Agrippina, though the evidence is inconclusive, Nero became emperor under his mother's guidance. The first 5 years of his reign, the famous Quinquennium Neronis, were generally considered successful. Under the influence of advisors like Seneca and Burrus, Nero governed reasonably well. Taxes were reduced, diplomatic solutions were found to foreign policy challenges, and the young emperor showed a taste for popular reforms. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. Nero chafed under his mother's control. Agrippina, who had engineered his rise to power, expected to rule through him. Their power struggle came to a head in 59, when Nero had his mother murdered after multiple failed attempts. An unprecedented act of matricide that shocked Rome. With Agrippina gone, the darker aspects of Nero's personality began to emerge unchecked. He became increasingly focused on his artistic pursuits, singing, acting, chariot racing, activities that Romans considered beneath the dignity of an emperor. He neglected administrative duties in favor of performances where no one dared critique him. His personal life was similarly chaotic. He had married Octavia, daughter of Claudius, as a political match arranged by Agrippina. But by 58, he had fallen for Poppaea Sabina, the wife of his friend Otho. After sending Otho away to govern Lusitania, Nero made Poppaea his mistress. She reportedly urged him to divorce Octavia and marry her instead, which he eventually did in 62 after having Octavia banished on false charges of adultery and then forced to commit suicide. This was the first major scandal of Nero's personal life, the mistreatment and murder of his innocent first wife to make way for his ambitious mistress. But it wouldn't be the last. Poppaea herself died in 65. Allegedly kicked to death by Nero during an argument while pregnant with their second child. Their first, a daughter named Claudia, had died in infancy. After an elaborate display of public mourning for Poppaea, Nero married his third wife, Statilia Messalina, in 66. And then, while still married to Statilia, he created the bizarre arrangement with Sporus that we've been discussing. This pattern, discarding wives, taking mistresses, eventually creating a simulacrum of his dead second wife, reflects Nero's increasingly erratic personal behavior. But it also speaks to something deeper, his growing detachment from reality and his belief that he could reshape the world according to his whims. The Sporus episode coincided with other examples of Nero's increasingly unhinged behavior. In 64, the Great Fire of Rome destroyed much of the city. While Nero probably didn't fiddle while Rome burned, the fiddle didn't exist yet, for one thing. His response to the disaster was telling. He used the cleared land to build his massive Domus Aurea, Golden House, an enormous palace complex in the center of Rome that included artificial lakes, colonnades, and a 120-foot bronze statue of himself, the Colossus Neronis. This seizure of public land for private use alienated many Romans. To deflect blame for the fire, Nero scapegoated the small Christian community in Rome, launching the first Roman persecution of Christians and having many executed in gruesome public spectacles. By 65, opposition was growing. The Pisonian conspiracy, named after its leader Gaius Calpurnius Piso, was a genuine attempt to assassinate Nero and replace him with Piso. When the plot was discovered, Nero's response was brutal. Dozens of alleged conspirators were executed, including many prominent Romans like the poet Lucan and Nero's former tutor Seneca. Instead of recognizing these growing threats to his rule, Nero became even more detached from political reality. In 66 and 67, he embarked on his artistic tour of Greece, competing in various games and performances while neglecting affairs of state back in Rome. It was during this period that Sporus, now transformed into Empress Sabina, accompanied him as his consort. By 68, when rebellion finally erupted in the provinces, Nero seemed genuinely surprised that his rule was in danger. His response to the crisis was ineffectual and disorganized, alternating between panic, denial, and bizarre performance art. Even as troops were marching on Rome, he was reportedly still rehearsing artistic performances and planning new spectacles. So how does Sporus fit into this larger pattern? I'd argue that the treatment of Sporus represents the logical endpoint of Nero's psychological evolution as emperor. By this point in his reign, Nero had come to believe that reality itself was malleable, that his will alone could reshape the world and the people in it. Just as he could transform Rome with his Golden House, just as he could transform himself from emperor to artist on the Greek stage, so too could he transform a random teenager into the living embodiment of his dead wife. The Sporus episode wasn't just about grief or sexual desire. It was about power in its most absolute and corrupting form. For Nero, Sporus was less a person than a canvas on which to project his fantasies and display his power. In forcing Rome to acknowledge this teenager as an empress, to play along with the fiction he had created, Nero was demonstrating that his reality was the only one that mattered. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing aspect of this story. Not just the exploitation of one individual, tragic as that was, but the mindset it reveals, a belief that absolute power confers the right to remake others in whatever image the powerful desire. We've explored Nero's treatment of Sporus as a particularly extreme example of imperial excess. But to fully appreciate this story, we need to understand the broader context of Roman attitudes towards sexuality, gender, and power, because what made the Sporus episode so shocking to Romans wasn't necessarily what would shock us today. Roman sexuality operated on principles very different from our own. The central dichotomy wasn't between homosexual and heterosexual behavior, but between active and passive roles. A freeborn Roman male could engage in sexual behavior with partners of any gender without stigma, provided he took the active, penetrative role. To take the passive role was considered shameful and emasculating for a citizen male. This active-passive dichotomy mapped onto broader power structures in Roman society. Those with power and status, free adult male citizens, were expected to be active in all senses. Those without power, women, slaves, boys, foreigners, were expected to be passive. Sexual behavior was just one manifestation of this fundamental power dynamic. Within this framework, the emperor occupied a unique position. As the most powerful man in Rome, he was expected to embody the active, dominant masculine ideal. His sexual behavior was supposed to reflect his political position. He could take what and whom he wanted, but should never be taken. This context helps explain why Nero's behavior with Sporus was so scandalous to Romans. It wasn't just that he treated a male as a wife, though that was certainly part of it. It was that he publicly blurred gender boundaries in a way that undermined the very ideology of Roman masculinity and power. By dressing Sporus as a woman, giving him a woman's name, and treating him as an empress, Nero was engaging in gender transformation that Romans found deeply unsettling. And by subsequently taking the bride role himself in his marriage to Pythagoras, Nero was violating the fundamental expectation that the emperor should always be the active, dominant party in any relationship. These transgressions weren't just personal or sexual, they were political. They suggested that the boundaries between male and female, active and passive, ruler and ruled, were more fluid than Roman ideology allowed. For a society built on rigid status distinctions, this was profoundly threatening. Of course, these Roman attitudes are very different from our modern concerns. Today, we're rightly disturbed by the exploitation of a minor who could not meaningfully consent to this arrangement, the apparent physical modifications performed without consent, and the complete erasure of Sporus's identity in service to Nero's fantasies. These aspects of the story, the ones that most disturb modern readers, received relatively little attention from ancient commentators. This disparity highlights how profoundly our moral framework differs from that of ancient Rome, even as we continue to be fascinated by Roman history and culture. But if Roman and modern observers are disturbed by different aspects of the Sporus story, there's still a common thread: the recognition that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that this corruption often expresses itself through the exploitation of those with no power to resist. Throughout history, we see similar patterns repeated wherever power is concentrated without accountability. From the Ottoman sultans' harems to the pleasure palaces of modern dictators, the powerful have often treated others as objects for their gratification, sometimes even reshaping them physically or psychologically to match their desires. What makes the Sporus episode particularly striking is not just what happened, but how public it was. Nero didn't keep this arrangement private. He flaunted it, forcing Rome's elite to acknowledge Sporus as an empress and participate in the fiction he had created. This public dimension transformed a private exploitation into a political statement about the emperor's power to define reality itself. In this sense, Nero's treatment of Sporus parallels his broader approach to governance. Just as he forced Rome to pretend that a teenage boy was an empress, he forced them to pretend that his artistic performances were brilliant, that his architectural excess was glorious, and that his rule was legitimate, despite his growing detachment from practical governance. The Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and the Roman elite played along with these fictions until they couldn't anymore, until the gap between Nero's manufactured reality and actual reality became too wide to sustain. The rebellion that ultimately toppled him wasn't just a power grab. It was a reassertion of reality against an emperor who had lost touch with it. And what about Sporus himself? As we've seen, he remains a cipher in our historical sources, defined entirely by what was done to him rather than by his own thoughts or actions. But his tragic fate after Nero's death suggests that he had become so thoroughly identified with the emperor's fiction that he couldn't escape it even after Nero was gone. Passed from Nero to Nymphidius to Otho to Vitellius, Sporus remained trapped in the role that had been created for him, valued not for himself, but for his symbolic connection to Nero and Poppaea. His reported suicide before Vitellius could use him in a public spectacle represents perhaps his only recorded act of agency, a final refusal to be further exploited as an object of public entertainment. In this light, Sporus emerges not just as a victim of Nero's excess, but as a symbol of how power structures can completely subsume individual identity. His original self, whatever name, family, and aspirations he had before catching Nero's attention, was so thoroughly erased that it left no trace in the historical record. What remains is only the role he was forced to play in someone else's drama. We've reached the end of our journey through one of ancient Rome's strangest and most disturbing episodes. The story of Sporus, from anonymous teenager to imperial empress to tragic suicide, offers a window into the darkest aspects of Roman imperial power. But it also raises questions about how we approach history, especially when dealing with marginalized figures who left no records of their own. Throughout this account, we've had to rely on sources written by elite men decades after the events they describe, none of whom showed much interest in Sporus as a person. He appears in their narratives primarily as a prop in the story of Nero's depravity, a symbol rather than an individual with his own perspective and agency. This imbalance reflects a broader problem in ancient history. Our sources overwhelmingly represent the viewpoints of the powerful, while the voices of the marginalized, women, slaves, provincials, and others without political power, are largely silent. We know about Sporus at all only because of his proximity to an emperor. Countless others who suffered similar or worse fates have disappeared from the historical record entirely. So how should we approach these gaps in the record? Some historians have turned to what's sometimes called reading against the grain, looking for the traces of marginalized voices in sources that didn't intend to preserve them. Others use comparative evidence from better documented periods or regions to make educated guesses about the experiences of those who left no written record. In the case of Sporus, we might look for small hints of agency or resistance in the limited accounts we have. His apparent loyalty to Nero until the end, for instance, might reflect a strategic adaptation to impossible circumstances, rather than passive acceptance. His suicide before Vitellius could use him in a public spectacle suggests a determination to control at least the manner of his death, if not his life. But we should be cautious about projecting our own values and expectations onto historical figures. We can't know with certainty what Sporus thought or felt about his bizarre situation. The psychological concepts we might use to understand his experience, trauma, identity, agency, weren't part of the Roman conceptual framework. What we can say with confidence is that Sporus's story illuminates the extreme power disparity that characterized the Roman imperial system. An emperor could literally reshape another human being according to his whims, and no one, not the Senate, not the law, not the victim himself, had the power to prevent it. This is perhaps the most important lesson from this disturbing episode. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that corruption often manifests as the exploitation and objectification of those without power to resist. From Nero to modern dictators, we see this pattern repeated throughout history. The story also reminds us that progress in human rights and dignity is neither automatic nor inevitable. The Roman Empire, for all its architectural and administrative achievements, existed within a moral framework that accepted slavery, exploitation, and the absolute authority of the powerful over the weak as natural and proper. 2,000 years later, we like to think we've advanced beyond such acceptance of exploitation. But have we really? Throughout the modern world, power imbalances continue to enable abuse and objectification, from human trafficking to exploitative labor practices, to the use of power to obtain sexual gratification without consent. The details have changed, but the fundamental dynamic that allowed Nero to remake Sporus in the image of his dead wife, the ability of the powerful to impose their will on the powerless, remains a constant in human societies. Recognizing this continuity might be uncomfortable, but it's essential if we want to learn from history, rather than simply gawk at its excesses. At the same time, we shouldn't fall into the trap of assuming that ancient Romans were simply moral monsters by our standards. Most Romans would have been as shocked by Nero's treatment of Sporus as we are, even if for somewhat different reasons. The historical record makes clear that Nero's behavior was considered extreme and transgressive even in his own time. One reason it was so useful as propaganda against him after his death. So, where does this leave us with Sporus? Perhaps the best we can do is acknowledge both what we know and what we don't. We know he was a teenager who became the object of an emperor's bizarre fantasy, forced to assume the identity of a dead woman and paraded before Rome as an empress. We know he was passed from one powerful man to another after Nero's death, treated as property rather than a person. And we know he ultimately took his own life rather than face further humiliation. What we don't know, and will never know, is how he understood his own experience, what strategies he developed to cope with his situation, or what dreams and hopes he might have had beyond mere survival. These aspects of his humanity are lost to history, preserved neither in monuments nor in texts. In this sense, Sporus stands for countless others throughout history whose lives were shaped or destroyed by the whims of the powerful, but whose own perspectives remain unrecorded. By acknowledging these gaps in our historical knowledge, we recognize the limitations of a historical record built primarily by and for the privileged. And perhaps that's the final lesson of this strange, sad story. History is never neutral or complete. It reflects the perspectives and priorities of those who recorded it, often at the expense of those who couldn't. By reading critically and empathetically, we can try to recover some sense of those lost perspectives. Not perfectly, but enough to remind ourselves that behind every historical anecdote about the powerful lay the lives of real people who laughed, suffered, hoped, and endured in ways that often went unrecorded. Sporus was one such person, reduced to a footnote in Nero's story by ancient writers, but deserving of recognition as more than just an object of imperial whim. In remembering him not just as Nero's victim, but as a human being caught in extraordinary circumstances, we do a small justice to his memory, and to all those whose voices history has silenced. Before we wrap up completely, let's take a moment to address some questions that might have occurred to you during this disturbing journey through Neronian Rome. Because a story this bizarre inevitably raises issues that go beyond the straightforward historical narrative. First, how historically reliable is this whole account? We've already discussed our main sources, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and to a lesser extent Tacitus, and their limitations. But it's worth emphasizing that ancient historical writing functioned differently from modern scholarship. Ancient historians saw their work as partly literary and moral, not just factual. They often included rumors, gossip, and morality tales alongside verifiable events. This doesn't mean we should dismiss the Sporus story entirely. The core elements appear consistently across multiple sources, suggesting some basis, in fact. And the story is so unusual that it seems unlikely to have been invented wholesale. It's too specific and bizarre to be standard anti-Nero propaganda. What's more likely is that the basic outline happened. Nero did take a young male who resembled Poppaea, have him physically altered in some way, dress him as a woman, and call him by Poppaea's name. But that the details were embellished or exaggerated by later writers eager to portray Nero in the worst possible light. The public wedding ceremony, for instance, might have been a more private ritual that grew in the telling. The extent of Sporus's physical alteration is also unclear from the sources, with different scholars interpreting the vague Latin terminology differently. And Sporus's emotional response to all this, whether he was completely unwilling or found ways to adapt to, and perhaps even leverage his position, is simply not addressed in our sources. A second question. Why has this story received relatively little attention in popular accounts of Roman history? If you've watched documentaries or read popular books about Nero, you might have heard about his matricide, his persecution of Christians, his fiddling while Rome burned, or his artistic pretensions. But the Sporus episode often gets only a brief mention, if it's included at all. Part of this may be simple discomfort. The story involves elements: exploitation of a minor, forced gender reassignment, sexual coercion, that make modern audiences deeply uncomfortable, and for good reason. It's easier to focus on Nero's artistic excesses or political failures than on this disturbing personal exploitation. There's also the challenge of telling this story without sensationalizing it. Many accounts either minimize what happened to avoid seeming prurient, or else lean too far into the sensational aspects without adequate historical context. Finding the right balance, acknowledging the exploitation without voyeurism, providing context without excusing, is genuinely difficult. And then there's the problem of language and concepts. How do we even describe what happened to Sporus using modern terminology? Was this a case of forced transgender identity, a form of sexual slavery, an extreme manifestation of imperial power? None of our modern categories map perfectly onto Roman concepts and practices, making the story difficult to frame for contemporary audiences. This brings us to perhaps the most important question. What can we learn from this disturbing episode? Beyond the lurid details and the shock value, what does Sporus's story tell us about power, history, and human experience? One lesson is about the extremes of absolute power. Nero's treatment of Sporus represents what happens when a ruler's will faces no meaningful constraints, when personal whim, no matter how bizarre or harmful, can be enacted without opposition. The story is a stark reminder of why checks on executive power are essential in any political system. Another lesson concerns how we remember the past. Sporus appears in our historical record only as an object of Nero's desire, not as a subject with his own perspective. This reflects broader patterns in how history has traditionally been written, centering the powerful and marginalizing everyone else. By acknowledging these limitations in our sources, we can read more critically and imaginatively, looking for the hidden stories of those who left no records of their own. A third lesson involves the complexity of historical judgment. It's easy to condemn Nero's treatment of Sporus from our modern perspective, and we should. But simply labeling the episode as evil doesn't help us understand how it could happen, or why contemporary Romans objected to it for reasons quite different from our own. Historical understanding requires us to recognize both the universal aspects of human experience and the ways in which past societies operated with different moral frameworks and assumptions. Finally, Sporus's story reminds us that behind every historical anecdote about the powerful lay the lives of real people who had no choice about their place in history. For every emperor or general whose name and deeds we remember, countless others lived and died unrecorded, their experiences shaped by forces beyond their control, their voices silenced by time and power. In remembering Sporus, not just as Nero's victim, but as a human being caught in extraordinary and terrible circumstances, we do a small justice to his memory and to all those whose stories history has overlooked. We acknowledge that the past, like the present, was made not just by the famous few whose names we know, but by the many whose lives and sufferings went largely unrecorded. We've covered the strange, sad story of Sporus from beginning to end, from anonymous teenager to imperial empress to tragic suicide. But before we close, I want to address some of the broader historical questions that this episode raises, particularly about Nero himself and the society that produced him. Nero remains one of history's most controversial figures, portrayed either as a monster of depravity or as a misunderstood artist-emperor slandered by his enemies. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. The historical Nero was neither the cartoonish villain of tradition nor the maligned cultural visionary some modern revisionists suggest. What's clear is that Nero's reign represented a crucial turning point in Roman imperial history. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of emperors connected by blood or adoption to Augustus, Rome's first emperor. With his suicide, that dynasty ended, plunging Rome into the chaos of civil war and eventually leading to the rise of the Flavian dynasty under Vespasian. Nero's reign also marked a shift in how imperial power was understood and exercised. Earlier emperors like Augustus and Tiberius had maintained at least the fiction of partnership with the Senate, presenting themselves as first citizens rather than absolute monarchs. Nero, especially in his later years, abandoned these republican pretenses and embraced a more overtly despotic style of rule. This shift was reflected in his treatment of Sporus and others in his inner circle. Augustus would never have dreamed of publicly marrying a male and presenting him as an empress, not necessarily because he was more virtuous than Nero, but because he understood the importance of maintaining Roman social norms, at least in public. Nero, by contrast, seemed to delight in flouting these norms and forcing Rome's elite to accommodate his personal whims, no matter how bizarre. This tension between the emperor's personal desires and the social expectations of Rome's elite would continue to shape imperial politics long after Nero's death. Later, bad emperors like Commodus and Elagabalus would face similar criticism for their perceived excesses and violations of Roman propriety. The Sporus episode also highlights the extreme vulnerability of those without status or power in Roman society. While freeborn Roman citizens had certain legal protections, though these were often ignored in practice, especially under bad emperors, those of lower status, freedmen, slaves, foreigners, and others on the margins, had few if any rights that the powerful were bound to respect. We don't know Sporus's original status, whether he was freeborn, a freedman, or a slave, but his treatment demonstrates how completely someone could be remade according to an emperor's will. Even his name was not his own. Sporus was given to him by Nero, erasing whatever identity he had before. This erasure of identity wasn't unique to Sporus. Throughout the Roman world, slaves were regularly renamed by their masters, stripping them of their original cultural and personal identities. Women were identified primarily through their relationship to men, as someone's daughter, wife, or mother. Provincial subjects were expected to adopt Roman customs and even Roman names if they wanted to advance in imperial society. The extreme case of Sporus, forced not just to take a new name, but to assume an entirely new identity as someone else, represents an amplification of practices that were commonplace in Roman society. What made his situation unusual wasn't the basic dynamic of power and erasure, but the public and theatrical nature of that erasure. This theatrical quality brings us to another important aspect of Nero's reign: his obsession with performance and spectacle. Nero famously considered himself an artist, a singer, actor, and chariot racer, and invested enormous resources in public games and performances where he could display his supposed talents. His treatment of Sporus can be seen as an extension of this performative tendency. By publicly presenting this youth as his empress, by insisting that Rome's elite acknowledge and participate in this fiction, Nero was staging yet another performance, one where his absolute power allowed him to reshape reality itself according to his artistic vision. This blurring of the line between political power and theatrical performance would have disturbing echoes throughout history, from the elaborate court rituals of Louis XIV to the mass rallies of 20th-century dictators. When power becomes spectacle, and spectacle becomes a demonstration of power, the human costs can be enormous, especially for those like Sporus, who become props in someone else's performance. Finally, the story of Sporus raises questions about how we approach historical tragedies across vast gulfs of time and culture. How do we acknowledge the humanity of someone who left no record of his own voice? How do we avoid either minimizing his suffering or exploiting it for sensational effect? How do we recognize both the specificity of his historical context and the universal human elements of his experience? There are no easy answers to these questions, but by approaching historical figures like Sporus with both critical rigor and empathetic imagination, by acknowledging both what we know and what we don't, we can at least try to do justice to their memory. In the end, perhaps that's the best we can offer to Sporus across the centuries that separate us. Not just shock or pity, but recognition of his full humanity, even as we acknowledge how thoroughly that humanity was denied in his own time. By remembering him as more than just Nero's victim or a scandalous footnote, by insisting on his status as a person caught in extraordinary circumstances, we resist, in some small way, the erasure that defined his brief life in the historical record. And with that, we truly conclude our exploration of this strange, sad chapter in Roman history. A reminder that behind every historical anecdote about the powerful lie the lives of real people whose stories deserve to be told, even when they left no words of their own. If this deep dive into one of history's darker corners has given you something to think about, I hope you'll join me for future explorations of the past, not just its glories and achievements, but its complexities, contradictions, and human costs. Because history at its best isn't just about what happened, but about what it means for us today. Thanks for listening. And remember that even the strangest historical tales have something to teach us about our world and ourselves.